Hi, you're listening to the Full Stack Educator Podcast.
We provide relevant resources to new and aspiring independent school leaders to help you grow, succeed at work, and have a positive impact on the lives of students.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Matt.
On this podcast, we have insightful conversations with leaders from across all areas of independent school education.
We all faced a colossal change this week. In light of the sudden transition to distance learning and the uncertainty surrounding the coronavirus pandemic, we decided to delay the next episode of the Full Stack Educator Podcast. Instead, we want to offer you a bonus episode that we hope will provide you with guidance, insight, and some reassurance as you teach and lead while working remotely. This week, we had an enlightening conversation with Meredith Monk Ford, the Executive Director of FolioCollaborative. FolioCollaborative is a team of educators committed to the mission of developing the best possible system for enhancing faculty and staff development in independent schools. Meredith spends much of her time visiting independent schools around the country and the world to lead seminars and train administrators and teachers, facilitating conversations around professional growth, leadership, and the process of change. As schools rapidly shifted to distance learning this week, FolioCollaborative has been a leading voice and source of support for hundreds of schools. Let's join in the conversation. All right, well, welcome, Meredith. We're glad you could join us. Could you just give a brief introduction about yourself and the work that you do at FolioCollaborative?
Sure. So my name is Meredith Ford, and I'm the Executive Director of FolioCollaborative. We're a nonprofit that serves independent schools predominantly. We're both a professional development platform and community for teachers and school leaders. Sort of at our core, we really believe that in order to promote a growth mindset through your organization and to attract the best talent, you really have to support your teachers in an intentional way. And so our software is designed through goal setting and feedback and observation to create that sort of ongoing conversation around professional learning and practice between teachers and their supervisors and also their colleagues. And on top of that, we also have this really cool community of school leaders from all of the schools that participate in Folio who are contributing to our thinking. And it's been very exciting for us to kind of see that energy and support rally during this sort of uncertain time. And the members of the collaborative have really been calling on each other and us to connect them around how to help schools with this transition.
Yeah, I'm curious to know about your reach and your scale. How many schools do you currently partner with?
We currently have 165 schools around the world.
Wow, that's fantastic.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
We're really excited.
And then if you were to put, and you may not have this number, but if you were to put a number on the leaders in the community, what is the number that you would guess at for that size of that community?
I would say probably in terms of engaged people, at least 500 school leaders.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. That's
huge. I
huge.
mean, we gave people like 3 days notice on our webinars and we had over 50 people participating.
That's really great.
That's great.
Yeah. And you guys are a nonprofit, is that right?
We are. And that was really intentional because we wanted everyone to feel a part of this. So while we are trying to take all the information that we're learning from all of our schools and make Folio better, we're also engaged in, we think their feedback and experience really informs our decisions around the development of the platform and also the professional development that we provide. So we really value their contributions and their questions and their needs. And we use that as a way of shaping kind of where we're headed as an organization so that they feel a part of the development of both the platform and the professional support that we're providing.
So does your board, being that you're a nonprofit, does your board include some of the schools that you partner with? What does your board look like?
It does. So we have the chair of our board right now is actually Tim Fish, who's the Chief Innovation Officer for NAIS. And he's also, most people consider him the founder of Folio. So he's just such an amazing thought leader in this space and just in independent schools in general. So he was the one who originally took Folio on the road when we first separated from McDonough. And so now he's chairing our board. And then we have kind of a mix of business leaders and school heads.
Great.
Yeah,
Yeah, it really is an organic effort then. That's wonderful.
for sure.
Yeah. So you were speaking about collaboration and your recent online webinar. I know that Folio recently had a digital town hall meeting where you invited educational leaders to get on and talk about what everyone's facing. And I was curious if you could share some of the themes that came out of that meeting. I think a lot of us are familiar with a lot of the challenges, but what are educational leaders thinking right now based on what you saw in that meeting?
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges is that everyone is in a different place around this. So some schools started ramping up for this 3 weeks ago. Other schools, their teachers are on spring break and they're going to come back to this reality. And so that was one thing that was sort of interesting to hear some of the school leaders who have already started sort of piping up with recommendations that they had. I think the most important thing that we heard was to just keep it simple. The pace of information and change is just coming at people so quickly that it's hard to process. And if you try to respond to every little thing, you're just going to exhaust yourself and sort of frustrate your faculty. So I think keeping it simple was a really important lesson that we learned and heard from folks. Also, communication becomes that much more important when you can't see people. And I learned this the hard way when I went from teaching middle school history one day to sort of inheriting this business the next day with a remote team, that communication, like you just can't communicate enough. And so being thoughtful about that and strategic about that is something that came through for folks. And I think the other big piece is right now they're in a space where I think most schools are past that like crisis management moment, like, okay, this is our new reality. Now what? How do we help our teachers? And so I think that's where most schools are starting to get. And really, they're just trying to launch their schools into this online space or this distance learning space. And that's where they're focused for now. And I would predict that the next phase is going to be administrators realizing I can't see my people. How do I know what they need? How do I know how to help them? How do I communicate with them? And that's really where we're focusing our efforts, is around giving them ideas around remote faculty meetings and questions to ask faculty, and how do you take the pulse of your people? And, we think that's going to be kind of the next experience that most of our schools are going to have. So that's where we're focusing our efforts. One of the cool things that I heard from one of our participants that we're going to be highlighting next week, their school asked the students after the first couple days of remote learning, like, how are things going for you? And what she said was it was so eye-opening for the faculty, like what was important to them and what the faculty thought was going to be important to them.
Oh, I bet.
It was a real disconnect. And it really helped, I think, also to focus teachers around what was most important for the kids, which is really what this is all about, right?
Yeah. That seems to speak a lot to the need to be a little agile right now too, right? Like,
for sure,
you have to be careful about making any plans that commit you to a fixed course of action.
Yes. Well, and especially as more states are going to go to sheltering in place, and childcare and partners' jobs are going to become more of an issue. Thinking that you're going to be able to plan for the next 8 weeks is really kind of not the best way to go about this. It's going to be sort of a day-by-day thing, which I think is going to be really hard for teachers. Because they kind of like having the plan, and we're sort of building the plane as we're flying it.
You mentioned simplicity being a key theme. Did you get any sense of what the challenges were in terms of where is complexity sort of pushing forward? And when we're trying to keep things simple, did you get a sense of what's pushing back on that? What things are leaders trying to simplify but keep ending up coming back very complex?
Yeah, so I've been talking a lot with the president and head of school at one schoolhouse, Brad Rathgaber, about this. He was basically saying that, when they train teachers to teach for one schoolhouse, it takes them 6 months to get a teacher up and running. And I think some of our schools sort of have this hope or this vision that in 2 days worth of professional development, that's where they're going to be able to get their teachers.
Yeah.
And really, none of the people who are involved in this sort of have, most of the people involved in this don't have experience in this platform. And it's a completely different way of engaging students and teaching. So I think being, one of our school leaders said, be gentle with ourselves and our teachers around those expectations, and maybe try to keep our expectations around instruction and engagement very, very simple as we learn. Not with the expectation that it's going to continue that way, but at least to start, let's keep it simple to start, and then learn and iterate on a week by week basis.
Sounds like great advice.
Another thing that came through that I think we can't stress enough is, and this came through in that some of the conversation that we had around transitions, is just a sense of loss and the emotional toll that this is taking on people. You know, everyone that I've talked to has someone in their life that they're concerned about, who is in that sort of high risk category around COVID-19. So people's thoughts and emotions are occupied there. They're occupied around, how am I going to take care of, for example, in my life, I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. So I'm thinking, like, how am I going to keep a business running with no childcare, a full-time working husband, and a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old? And everyone has their version of that story, right? And so just like with kids, where if emotionally they're not in a good place, they can't learn, the same is true for adults. And so I think it's important as we manage this transition that maybe we're thinking about that first, as opposed to trying to hit the ground running with like this comprehensive teaching plan. We need to sort of take care of our people and take care of ourselves too.
Do you think this is harder on students or teachers, or is it just difficult in different ways?
So I think this is going to be a challenge for both students and teachers. The fact that they are used to a really clear framework and schedule for their day, and they're going from structured, clear time to the unknown in one fell swoop without any warning or choice about it. And I think that's going to be really hard for students as well, especially with the students in our schools. We know that they're scheduled and programmed from the minute they wake up until the minute they go to bed. And in this new reality, all of that is gone. So helping them to figure out, okay, without any structure, how do I build structure for myself? And in particular, kids with learning differences, where that is, executive function things are particularly hard, and without the same access to support, I think that's going to be a real challenge. And I think the same is true for teachers. At least that was my experience when I left the classroom to start running Folio. I went from knowing that I had to be in my classroom at 8:05 to, I don't know when should work start? Like, is what I'm doing right now considered work? And, working from home, like the idea of work kind of blends more with your life. And so you have to be proactive and thoughtful about creating some parameters around your workday. And I think that's a skill that I am still working on, and that, I've been doing that for 7 years.
Yeah, I remember that transition myself, and it's in one sense it's very refreshing, but yeah, it is. You have to learn to prioritize your own time, because that bell is not going to ring for you when you need to work on the next assignment.
Yes.
So in regards to leadership, one of the things that I think is great about FolioCollaborative is you all use on partnering with school leaders as they're engaging in professional development of their teachers. So what are some tips that you have been sharing? What are some best practices?
Yeah. So one thing I said to them as individuals is to start with a list, like always work from a list. And I think it's helpful to kind of plan that the night before. And the other piece of that is to pick your start time for your workday. So decide that like at 8:05, that is when I am officially in work mode. And then just start working from your list, because there's so much information coming at us. Like Twitter is going crazy and everyone's posting resources, and you can end up down these sort of rabbit holes and get kind of overwhelmed by the amount of information out there. And so I think putting some guardrails around how you work is important. As a leader, I think creating opportunities for people to access you in some way or another. So using something like a Calendly link and saying, anytime you need to just hop on a call with me, like click on this link and schedule 20 minutes, I'm here for you. Or figuring out a way to have office hours through Zoom so that people always know that from this time to this time, they can like walk into your virtual office, I think could be really helpful. And I also think one thing I learned with my own team was sort of building in a calendar of meetings was really helpful, so that people know that there's going to be a time at some point when we're all going to be able to be together and share ideas.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
And there's some accountability there.
Yeah. Well, and if you give it ahead of time, then people who have issues around childcare or competing commitments can schedule that, as opposed to calling it for the next morning, where then they have to kind of scramble. It also lets them know ahead of time, like, okay, there's going to be a touch point there, right? Yeah. Which I think can be reassuring for folks. And I think definitely, also highlighting the good work that's being done. As a team, we've been trying to look at this as an opportunity to learn some new things and try some new things and support schools in different ways that we didn't have time to do before. And I think school leaders need to continue to reframe this as not like this is something we have to do, but like how can we step back and see how this is a cool way to think about our practice differently? And how does this give us space to do some experimenting when, in the normal flow of the school day, we don't have time to do. And so I think helping teachers to reframe that constantly is going to be really important.
I hope we'll see that as we get past the crisis mode into looking at, I love that, looking at it as an opportunity.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, it's going to, we're going to be forced into being creative, right? Because you can't take a week's worth of lectures and throw them online for every class and expect kids to have a positive experience.
So. Yeah, and we're already seeing that, right? Like, I know of a teacher who held his track practice over a Zoom call, and the whole team got on a call, and he went out to the track to pretend like they were at track practice, and they just talked about how they were doing. Right. And it wasn't about the track practice. It was about connection and
that's
connecting
wonderful
with those kids, and then also connecting them back to the school. So, how can we get creative about how we go about doing that?
Let's talk for a minute, Meredith, about the asynchronous element of this. So there are schools that are definitely having live synchronous classes or meeting times. But I think there's a sizable number of schools, I'm thinking especially of boarding schools that have students either from around the United States or internationally that are really leveraging asynchronous tools and workflows and thinking about what does it look like to have students engaged in work asynchronously and not all live at the same time. What are some best practices or some things that leaders should be thinking about when working in the asynchronous space?
So I am definitely not an expert in terms of the instruction. I do think it's important that we understand sort of the challenges our students are facing at home. On one of our calls, someone brought up sort of kids in different home environments that's going to be a real challenge. There was just an article that came out in the Wall Street Journal about that for public schools, how they're even looking at this it's not going to count as school. They're going to consider it enrichment, because they can't guarantee that every student has access and the support they need to be able to do the work. And while we're not necessarily doing as much thinking about that in independent schools, I think it's more of an issue than we might realize. And so time is going to be a factor, access to the technology. And I also think there is the challenge of, Zoom has been so generous in sort of opening up their doors to support this transition for everyone, but there is definitely going to be, we're definitely going to tax the technological system. So I think thinking about ways that we can provide asynchronous work is going to be so important, because we may not be able to depend on Zoom on a daily basis for having class. We may need to provide activities and things for kids to do that aren't dependent on the internet and a computer screen, because, there may be times when things things don't go the way we want because there's just so much pressure on the system. Those are some of the things I've been thinking about.
So I love the emphasis that you placed in the town hall meeting on thinking in terms of transitions. And a few minutes ago, you talked about how that involves loss as well as what's coming next. What advice do you have? What are the main points that you would recommend school leaders be focusing on to help their teachers and their student and the students' families manage the transition?
So I think an interesting activity for school leaders to think about would be to look at, okay, so in this transition, what are people losing? And, I don't mean that in sort of I don't want it to sound too negative. I just think it's sort of what's going to be different for people. So what is it that they're losing? And are there ways that we could get creative in order to maybe not lose some of those things? And I think that could be a really powerful, so yes, we aren't going to be able to have morning meeting the way that we've always had it where everyone is in the same space. But because we can't do that, instead, we're going to record something or post something somewhere or open it up through Zoom. Or is there a way to replace it with something that would help with that transition so that they don't feel like it's such a foreign experience, kind of moving from being in person to remote learning. Yeah. And I also think it's important for leaders to be a little bit more transparent about sort of where they are in all of this, and that there are some things that they're worried about losing or that they don't know the answers to, because I think that will really help to reassure. I think it will help to reassure teachers that, we're kind of all in this together. We're all learning as we go. And I just saw a letter that was going home to families from one of our school heads, and it was sort of asking for that. Forgiveness is the wrong word, but like understanding and thoughtfulness around the fact that we're all trying to figure this out at the same time, and we're trying to get ahead of it, but we're in uncharted territory. And so to just be understanding of everyone as we do this work.
Yeah. What are some things that, not to focus on the negative, and maybe we'll talk about the positive here too, but what are some things we're losing? We're losing prom. We're losing morning meeting. What else? What have people mentioned?
Well, I mean, for little kids, you're losing that unstructured play and all of the learning that happens. I mean, if you've ever walked into an elementary school classroom, so much of the learning is happening on the walls, and in the tubs and on the tables. There's so much that is going to be lost and harder to replicate at home. But I think the most important thing that we're losing, which is really the independent school, is where we really shine, is connection. Yeah. Is the feeling like you can walk into a teacher's office and plop down and be like, I'm just so overwhelmed, like, please help me. Yeah. Or that you can, there are just those times and spaces where people can connect and build relationships. Yeah. So I think that's where schools can start too, is just how do we intentionally make sure that we don't lose that piece of who we are.
What are we gaining?
I think we're gaining creativity around how to deliver and instruct students. So I know that teachers have really gone crazy in terms of going online and finding new ways of teaching and sharing resources with each other. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's been so powerful, is everyone's willingness to share, right? Like this is the whole world is like in this together. So that sort of proprietary nature of things has kind of been put to the side because we're all just trying to get through this the best way that we can. And I think that's really cool. I also think this is the first time where, well, maybe not the first time, but in this moment, students are really the experts. Our schools are full of digital natives, and we cannot say the same for our faculty.
That is true.
So, while in some ways that might be terrifying, like, how can we capitalize on that? How can we really engage students in thinking about their learning in a really thoughtful way? Because they, in some ways, are the experts. So I think there's some opportunity there to really tap into their expertise and their understanding, and then also help them to understand better how they do learn. And for some of them, this is going to be their reality when they go out into the real world, right? And one of the things we're trying to do in our schools is prepare them for the real world. Well, this is about as real as it gets. So how can we reframe this around, like, okay, talk about real world experience, like we're living it, and how do we help them see that and learn from that, and become more self-sufficient and more independent in their learning.
Yeah, speaking to that, I wonder if you have any advice for especially school heads and maybe people focusing on school messaging. I've sensed just online connecting with different school leaders that there's a lot of anxiety around this idea of wanting to create more simplified versions of what's going on in our classrooms that are focused on connection, but then also the concern that parents are going to come back and say, like, but what about finishing the rest of my child's math curriculum or science curriculum? And so I think heads are really trying to balance, how much do we focus on social emotional support and connection, and how much are we trying to push forward content? And do you have any advice for school leaders who are wrestling with that?
So one of our schools had, instead of sending a letter home, they had a webinar open to the whole school community.
That's a fantastic idea.
And I thought that was so smart because, one, it makes it more human, right? Like, if you have this sort of official letter, people are going to interpret it in different ways, and they can all easily sort of respond quickly to the email with something sort of emotional, as opposed to kind of bringing them into the discussion in some way, and making them part of the solution. And I think that is really a smart thing. And I wonder if there's an opportunity to do that on kind of an ongoing basis, right? Like, for the first 2 weeks, our plan is just to help support and learn about what this new reality is going to look like. And then we're going to have another webinar where we can bring everyone together and get feedback and tell you what we're seeing and tell you how we're going to iterate for the next 2 weeks. And I think part of the challenge for school heads is we just don't know how long this is going to last. Right. I was talking to someone, a boarding school person, who was concerned about the impact on international students for next year. Right. Like, is this going to have an impact on enrollment? We don't know. And I think that's the really hard part for school heads, is we're operating under the best information we have at the moment. And we're going to iterate and do what we can and learn from it. And then we're going to adjust and do it again.
Yeah. Earlier in our conversation, you spoke a little bit about you and Matt both talked about the transition from, having a rigid schedule to all of a sudden being in control of your time. And I know that that's something you addressed a little bit in the webinar as well. Can you speak a little bit to the role of rituals in sort of mental health and emotional health, and just how to support healthy rituals both within our students and our teams?
Yes. So I think if there's any way to sort of continue on with whatever it is that you do between when you wake up and when you start your school day, if there's a way to kind of preserve that, I think that could be really powerful. I also think that finding a space that you identify as, like, when I'm in this space, I'm at work, can be really helpful for people working at home and for students.
A physical space. Yeah.
Physical space. And I recognize that there are a lot of limitations around that for people, because some students share a room with a sibling. Some students or teachers don't have an extra room in their house where they can set up their office. Yeah. So we're all going to have to get creative around that. And you can't go to Starbucks and do your work there. So we're all going to have to get creative around that. And but I just think something that sort of symbolizes, like, okay, I'm in work mode now, is important. Also, I've learned that it helps to not stay in my pajamas if I can help it.
Yeah.
Because it's just something like it's a signal to your brain, like, okay, I think we even heard of one school that's going to ask kids to come to class in their uniform.
Right.
So, I think there's some kind of interesting things to think about with that. The other piece that I think people have to build in is something around movement. When you're on these Zoom calls and you're at your computer, you can look up and all of a sudden realize like you haven't gotten up in 4 hours. And we're talking about kids and adults that are used to being on their feet all day, having some kind of walk between one class and another, having to walk to lunch, all of those things. That's an important part of priming our brains for learning. So also building in those breaks where you're physically getting up and moving, I think are really, really important to consider.
Yeah, that's great advice. One thing too, and you might be able to speak to this, Meredith, is I realized when I made that transition from teaching into a desk job, so to speak, feedback became so much more important. And that may just be something to do with my personality, but I didn't realize how much ongoing organic feedback you get in a classroom teaching. You are reading the students, you're reading and adjusting constantly. You're talking, hey, you're not going to believe what just happened in this class with a colleague. That does not happen in a desk job. If you're in an office by yourself, you got to get up and move around and talk to people.
Yes. So I think feedback needs to be happening on a couple levels. One, I think it should be happening for teachers. So we've been thinking about what would be a quick sort of pulse check that school administrators could send to teachers once a week to understand how they're feeling, because it's going to be harder to get a sense of how they're feeling around things when they can't walk down the hall and see them in their classrooms.
Right.
So we think that's going to be important. And we're working on figuring out like what are good questions that speak to the sort of emotional and intellectual needs of teachers, and in order to inform how leaders continue to support them as we move through this process. And for students, I think the same is true. I think there's an opportunity for them to learn more about how they learn best and experiment with that. So I think there's an opportunity for teachers to maybe ask some questions sort of related to metacognition and who these students are as learners. And I also think there's an opportunity for them to say to the kids, of all, my favorite way to gather quick feedback is called a plus delta. And it doesn't require a Google form. It doesn't require any special technology. You basically just say, okay, when you think back over the week, what are the things that we did that you liked, that worked for you as a learner, and what are the things you would do differently? And you would be amazed what students come up with when you say, what would you do differently? And especially if that's something that you practice on a weekly basis, students become very thoughtful about that feedback. And it's not what they didn't like. I think that's a really important difference, because then it just becomes like a list of complaints. Saying, what would you do differently, really forces them to think about how to tweak something that you're already doing. And that takes an extra minute to think about that, but it's also way more informative. So if they said, it would help if instead of a 40-minute Zoom call, you pre-recorded this the day before and we could watch it on our own time, and then we had 20 minutes with you to ask questions, right? Like that's the kind of thing. And you're like, oh, well, that's an easy tweak. Actually, that would be better, right? And especially if teachers can demonstrate that they are iterating and responding to that feedback, students just become more committed and thoughtful about the practice. So I think that's a really great way for us to model. And again, opportunity for us to model at all levels that growth mindset. I'm out of my comfort zone. You're out of your comfort zone. We're going to try this thing. We're going to be learning together. You're going to give me feedback and I'm going to adjust. And so I think that can be really powerful. And I mean, I used to do that with my 7th graders. I've done it with 5th graders. I haven't done it with any group lower than 3rd graders, but, it's pretty cool to kind of hear what they have to say. And if it becomes a regular practice, that's a really good thing to model for them as a life skill.
I'd like to ask a question. And Michael, actually, you may have some great resources here too, but there are certain subjects that lend themselves better to this type of learning, like math, languages. They don't require a lot of stuff, or the stuff that you need is easily transferred, digitally. Chemistry, not so much, right? You've got to do something hands-on. In the arts, I mean, I'm sure technical theater can come up with something to do for the class online, but unless you're building a set, you're really not accomplishing what you're doing in technical theater. What resources, where do you see those teachers going now that we're past sort of the crisis mode? Let's figure out something, anything. Okay, we've now got to get content transferred forward. And then, from a leadership and a staffing perspective, if I'm the fine arts chair, what am I telling my faculty right now? If I'm the science chair and I've got maybe biology taken care of, what am I telling the other folks? How do we get past treading water into actually transferring content when you need stuff?
One thing I've heard of some schools have been using, or some teachers have been using, they've been finding a lot of help from online Facebook groups.
Okay.
So like I think I was talking to one teacher, she's an AP psych teacher, and there's like this really powerful psych community. They have a big Facebook group. So I think that some of those kinds of resources have been bubbling up, or people have really been populating those a lot. Pinterest, I think, is also kind of an interesting creative place to go. That maybe teachers don't think of initially when they're like, where do I find good resources? But I think that's another option. Okay. One schoolhouse has really been working to try and generate a lot of support for teachers. So that would be another resource. Yeah, so those are some of the ones I can think of off the top of my head. Our focus has really been, we want to help schools help teachers. So what we're trying to think about is, how do we give the leaders tools that they can use to then support the teachers in this process. So it's not necessarily my area of expertise, but that's just what I've heard from folks that I've been speaking with.
Well, great. 3 questions. What should people be reading? What should people be listening to? And then we'll close up with how people can connect with you. So what should people be reading and listening to?
Well, I'm not sure what people should be reading, but I can tell you what we've been reading at Folio.
Great.
And I think anything by Amy Edmondson around psychological safety, I think could be a really helpful resource for folks right now. I recently went through Elena Aguilar's training on the art of coaching teams. And I think that book has some really great resources around how to structure your meetings and think about building trust. That's another huge thing that I think this remote transition is going to shine a big light on, is sort of the relationships that leaders have or don't have with their people. Because there has to be a really high level of trust with the people that you're leading, that if you haven't made that a priority and you haven't invested in that, it's going to be a much harder transition for you. And I think she has some good resources around that. I've also been reading The Year Without Pants, or My Year Without Pants, which is by Scott Birkin. And I bought that at some point when I was really struggling with remote working, and just trying to think about what lessons can we take from his experience and sort of transfer them to the school environment. Culture Code is another one that's by Dan Coyle. And I just love that one because it's just sort of all about the importance of culture. And so that's a priority for us right now, is how do we help schools preserve culture? And my 2 fun reads right now, one is called Present Over Perfect, and the other one is The Whisper Network. So Presence Over Perfect is about this professional woman and sort of this realization that she comes to in her 30s when she's trying to balance her work life and her family, and sort of how she realizes sort of how unhappy she is and how she kind of needs to take a step back and reevaluate everything and sort of come at things from a different angle.
Nice.
I love that book. My wife has that book. I read it a few months ago. I think it's Shauna Niequist. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Correct. I've been listening to it. We just got a new dog, so that's the other thing I've been listening to. Besides your podcast, is her book on audio, and the Whisper Network. That's just a fun one about these female attorneys in this big athletic conglomerate, kind of like a Nike or an Under Armour. That sort of it's all about. It's like a Me Too kind of book. Kind of about what it's like to be a professional woman in sort of a man's world and how they deal with that. But it's a really fun read. It's interesting and brings up a lot of interesting issues related to women in leadership and power. So, what
should people be listening to?
Well,
in terms of music or podcasts or whatever you like.
Yeah. So I do a lot of my reading on audiobooks. So,
great. Yeah.
The best way to, Audible and stuff can be a little expensive, but you can access a lot of that through your library.
Mm-hmm.
So I highly recommend that for people that haven't done that. But
yes.
I think music that you love is a really important thing to be listening to right now.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like our school leaders are just so focused on like churning things out and keeping things going and maybe not thinking as much about self-care. And if they aren't taking care of themselves, they're not going to be able to take care of their teams. So unplugging from some of this, not keeping a very close eye on Twitter, it can just be so overwhelming. And I also really enjoy Jason Fried's podcast, or like any of the talks that he does with people. He's one of the founders of 37 Signals, and he has sort of interesting stuff around remote work. So that's the other thing I've been listening to.
Great. Well, we'll put links to all of those in the show notes too, everything you just mentioned.
So how can people connect with you and FolioCollaborative? Yeah,
so our website, which is foliocollaborative.org, has a special link at the top for resources related. We're sort of calling them COVID resources for admins. And it's just a huge page gives you access to a recording of the town hall that we did, some of the tools that we've been developing, and we're continuing to add to those every week. The blog, I've been writing a lot about sort of my perspective on leadership as we go through all of this. And so you can kind of read about that there. And
nice.
On our leadership page, there's information on how to email us directly. That's probably the best way.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. We've enjoyed talking to you. It's been very interesting. These are interesting times, and I'm glad we've got in the independent school community, I'm glad we've got leaders like you to help navigate. I know plenty of school heads are depending on you and division heads as well. So thank you for taking the time to chat with us. Michael, anything to add?
No, I want to echo what you just said. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time and your expertise, and this has been a fantastic conversation.
Well, thank you. I get really excited about these things, so this is a treat for me and interesting to think about these from your perspective. So I appreciate your time.
Thank you for listening to the Full Stack Educator podcast. We hope that today's conversation helped you grow as an independent school leader. Be sure to check out our show notes for links to resources mentioned in the podcast.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, rate it, leave a review, and share it with a friend. Episodes of this podcast are released bi-weekly. You can follow and engage with Matt McGee and Michael Amusio on LinkedIn.